I. Heavy thick clouds filled the sky, engulfing the countryside in darkness that lingered over the little village of Stoneville like an abysmal smog. The rain poured down steadily in a monotonous, unceasing patter. The wind wailed as it whistled through the branches of trees that were weird, distorted shapes in the dismal early spring night. Edwin Bro's rugged face was wet and grim as he plodded across the meadows toward the glen. His eyes constantly probed the shadows, searching, for Bro felt the fear of sudden death hanging over him. It was an intangible feeling, yet real and unshakable. The man who had written him the letter suggesting that they meet at the old Cedar Inn tonight to discuss a business proposition was a total stranger. Yet about that letter there had been an underlying current of menace. I'm a fool to meet him at the roadhouse, Bro said aloud to himself. And yet it might mean a chance to get rid of them at last. The sound of his own voice seemed strange to his ears, and he lapsed into brooding silence as he walked on. The wind tugged at his heavy overcoat as if striving to pull it from his big frame. The rain beat against his face, cold and chilling. He left the last stretch of the meadowland now and entered the small tract of woods that formed the glen. Moist leaves and brush made soft swishing sounds beneath his feet. The trees stood close together here and occasionally a low-hanging branch swept against his hat. "There's the inn," he muttered gratefully. "About time I was getting there." Bro uttered a sigh of relief as he saw the low, ramshackle building looming dimly in a clearing ahead. It was a blurred, box-like shape only half visible through the driving rain, a faint light indicating its half-open door. A weather-beaten sign creaked noisily as it swung in the wind. Even though it was impossible in the darkness to read the words painted on it, Edwin Bro knew the faded letters read. Cedar Inn. Bro strode across the clearing, reaching the road that ran along the front of the place. He realized that he might have traveled on this road, but the distance was longer than the short cut he had taken across the meadows. His attitude changed as he approached the half-open door. Why should he be afraid? He had always been hard and ruthless, a man his enemies had found dangerous. It was just the weather, the bleak chill, the constant patter of the rain and the wailing of the wind. He pushed the door open wide and stepped into the small hall between the entrance and the barroom of the old inn. The light from an oil lantern resting on a rickety table cast his shadow as he stepped forward. His own tall figure became a huge black form hovering on the grimy wall. Behind him, the door swung silently closed. "You're next." The words lingered in the quiet that had gripped the old inn with the closing of the door. At first, Bro was relieved by the apparent casualness of the greeting, even though he could not see the man who had spoken. Then it suddenly dawned on him that there was something cold and horrible in those words. Again the strange feeling of impending tragedy swept over him, stronger now than it had been before. "Who's there?" he called loudly. He stood listening. Dimly, he could hear the rain beating on the roof. In the flickering light of the lantern he saw the hall grimy with dust. From the bar beyond he smelled the sourness of stale beer. "You're next." The voice coming from the bar sounded like the echo of the one that had spoken before. Bro advanced toward the bar without looking back. That was why he failed to see the short, stocky man who had been hidden behind the open door, and who was now behind him. "I've been waiting for you, Bro," said the man in the bar. A handkerchief masked the Danny part of his face, and his soft gray hat was pulled down so that only his eyes were visible. His right hand, stuffed in the side pocket of his overcoat, appeared to be clutching a gun. "Thomas Hernandez," said Bro tensely. "You don't need to disguise your face. I recognize your voice." "Good." The masked man's tone was cold, almost lifeless. "Then you know what I mean when I said that you are next, Bro." "But I don't know," protested Edwin Bro. "Just what do you mean, Hernandez?" "That you are." Hernandez's voice was grim. "Sure, I've killed others, but this is something I've dreamed about for a long time, something I've looked forward to." The masked man moved closer to Bro. Bro began to retreat toward the door. "This is the finish for you, Bro," said Hernandez. Bro turned to run, but he was too late. Hands clutched savagely at his throat, strong fingers gouging into the flesh. He fought, writhing and twisting, trying to squirm out of the grip of those hands. He clawed wildly at the fingers, his face red, his eyes glassy. "I've waited for this," Hernandez sobbed, as his hands tightened their death grip. The fingers pressed tighter and tighter, digging into the flesh. Bro's face turned purple, his eyes starting. Finally he shuddered convulsively and then went limp. Even then, the vice-like fingers did not release their grip as they slowly let the heavy body sag to the floor. The killer unclasped his hands from Bro's throat and stood erect. He gazed down at the limp form. Then he leaned over and hastily went through Bro's pockets, returning each item after he had examined it. He swore when he had completed his search. He had failed to find what he was seeking. But I told him in my note to bring them, he muttered to himself. It was supposed to be a business deal. He glared at the corpse. You've tricked me again, damn you. Hernandez swung around as he heard the door of the inn open and then close. Footsteps came across the creaking boards. The killer waited tensely, his hand clutching the gun in his overcoat pocket. A short, thick-set man entered, his mouth flying open in a gasp of horror as he saw the body sprawled upon the floor. You killed him, stammered the smaller man. Yes. Thomas Hernandez nodded. I did just what I intended to do. He glared at the other man. Where have you been, Jim? I was hiding behind the door, like you said to do. When he come in, I let the door swing closed. He didn't see me. Then when he went in here, I stepped outside. The short, stocky man shuddered. I knew there was going to be trouble.
But I didn't know it would be murder.
Now that you do know, you'll never tell anyone who killed him, will you, Jim? Said Hernandez pointedly. No, but the police, they'll find him here. That's where you're wrong. They won't find him here. The masked man looked at his companion. You've never seen my face at all, have you, Jim? You've always been masked when you was with me, Mr. Hernandez, said Jim. Good. It wouldn't be nice if you were to recognize me and tell the police anything, said Hernandez. If I even suspected that you would, you'd die, Jim. I ain't saying a thing, Mr. Hernandez. I'm glad of that, said the masked man. You see, except for you, no one around here knows me by the name of Hernandez. He stepped toward the corpse. Come on. Help me carry him. Carry him where? Asked the thick-set man. Never mind where. Hernandez reached down casually and lifted the body by the head and shoulders. Just take his feet. Reluctantly, Jim took the legs of the corpse. With the body between them, they went outside. Put him down, Hernandez said shortly. Now go back and put out the lights and lock the door. The thick-set man hurried to carry out the order. The lights inside the inn went out, and then the door closed as Jim stepped outside again into the pouring rain. Once more, the two men picked up the body. In a few moments they were gone from sight. 2. Henry Roper, chief of police of Stoneville, yawned and leaned back lazily in his chair. The bright sunlight was a relief after 3 days of rain. Suddenly he reached up with one hand and flicked a fly off his bald head. Then he glanced at the husky, dark-haired young man who sat opposite his desk. How do you like Stoneville, now that you've been here a couple of days? He asked. Guess you find it pretty quiet for a big-town detective, don't you, Gumbo? It's quiet, all right. Danny Gumbo smiled as he looked out the window. But, as I told you, I'm on a vacation. I wanted to get away from the noise and excitement of New York. The telephone on the chief's desk jangled. Roper picked up the receiver. Hello? He snapped. Who? Edwin Bro? What happened? I see. All right, get out there as fast as you can and wait until I come. Did you phone Jacob? Good. Get going, Mike. The chief slammed the receiver back on the hook, then leapt to his feet and grabbed his uniform cap. Roper was a small man who always moved briskly when he went into action. Danny Gumbo looked at him questioningly. Edwin Bro was in an accident out near the Glen, explained Roper. Don't know just what happened, but I've got to go out there. Bro's one of the richest men around here. The chief looked curiously at the husky, dark-haired detective from New York. Want to come along? Sure. Gumbo got swiftly to his feet, licked up his hat and coat. Thanks for inviting me, Chief. Vacation or not, I'm getting a little tired of doing nothing but just loaf around. They hurried downstairs and climbed into the chief's sedan, which was parked at the curb. A few moments later they left the village behind and were speeding out into the country. Finally they reached a spot where a bank rose steeply, almost like a cliff, and ran parallel with the right side of the road for some considerable distance. 100 yards ahead there appeared signs of building operations in progress on top of the cliff-like bank. As Roper stopped the car, several heaps of bricks became visible to Gumbo, and mountainous piles of slate and the half-completed skeleton of a low, one-story building. That will be Andy Wilson's new gas station when it's finished, said the chief, nodding toward the building operations. Good location. Gumbo's gray eyes were fixed on a group of men gathered about something lying on the ground near a pile of yellow sand. There was a motorcycle patrolman in the crowd. "What happened, Mike?" demanded Roper, as he and Gumbo got out of the car and joined the group. "Accident, Chief," answered the motorcycle policeman. Mr. Bro was smothered to death under a pile of sand. Mike waved his hand toward the top of the bank where a small dump Vic cart loaded with sand was standing. "There were 2 carts up there yesterday. The storm must have blown one of them over last night at the very moment Bro was passing underneath." "Who found him?" asked Danny Gumbo. "The workmen discovered the body a little while ago when they started to reload the cart that had dumped over," said Mike. "Bro was completely buried at the bottom of the sand pile. One of the men on the job drove back to the crossroads just as I came along. When he told me what happened, I phoned you, Chief, and then came here at once." Gumbo walked over and bent down beside the still form. The body had been moved to a spot a little distance from the sand pile. The dead man was big. His strong face was deeply scored with lines, and his dark hair was plentifully streaked with gray. Gumbo put Bro's age at about 45. "Died from suffocation, all right," said Roper, as he joined Gumbo and stood looking down at the corpse. "He just couldn't push his way out from under that pile of wet sand." "Yes, it would be a tough trick for a dead man. Look at his throat. There are still signs of his having been strangled. Those black and blue marks could only have been made by someone choking him to death." Roper studied the corpse intently. It was quite obvious now that Edwin Bro had died of suffocation. His face was bluish, his tongue swollen, his eyes distended and suffused with blood. "You're right," Roper said. "Yes, you are. Those marks on his throat tell the story. It's murder." "Wonder what he was doing out here last night?" said Gumbo. "It seems certain that this happened last night, though your coroner can tell us exactly the time." "We haven't a coroner here," Roper said. "There's only one doctor in Stoneville, so we send for him when anything like this happens." He glanced at the motorcycle patrolman. "Did you call Dr. Jacob, Mike?" "Yes, sir," said Mike. "The doctor was out on a call, but I left word for him to come out here as soon as he returned. And I didn't notify the Bro family. I thought you and the doctor would want to take care of that, Chief." "Yes, I'll break the news just as soon as I get the doctor's report," Roper said. He glanced at Gumbo as the patrolman walked away. "Macaulay is a good man. Been here about 6 months. He bought old Dr. Walker's practice not long before Walker died. I still would like to know what Bro was doing out here in the first place," Gumbo said thoughtfully. "He was rich. And he owned that estate called Ridgeway Manor, didn't he?" "Yes. It used to belong to the Dayton family, but Bro bought the place about 2 years ago." The chief bit off the end of a cigar and lighted it. "What are you driving at, Gumbo?" "Bro must own at least 1 car. Then why did he walk last night when he could have ridden? There's only one answer. He was going someplace or meeting someone, and didn't want to be recognized. Then he walked along this road, was murdered, and then somebody buried him beneath the sand," Roper said. "No," Gumbo corrected. "Bro was carried here. Look at the soles of his shoes. They're caked with dirt and ashes. He was killed in some dry place, for the rain would have washed that dirt off his shoes as he walked. He's big and heavy, so whoever brought him here couldn't have carried him very far. Are there any houses around here, Chief?" "None until you get to Dunston 5 miles from here. There isn't a building between Stoneville and Dunston except that old roadhouse, the Cedar Inn." "What about it?" asked Gumbo with interest. "No one would want to go there," Roper said. "It's old and run down, and only the owner is there most of the time. Bro wouldn't have gone to a place like that." Danny Gumbo decided that Bro looked like a man who would go any place he felt like going, including an old rundown roadhouse, but he saw no point in arguing with the local lawman about it. There were angles to this case that interested him greatly, and he was suddenly anxious to go along with Roper until they reached the final solution. A mud-spattered roadster drove up then and stopped behind Roper's car. A tall, thin man, with a reddish mustache, got out of the car. He was carrying a small black bag. "That's Dr. Jacob," Roper explained. "As soon as we talk to the doctor, I think we should interview Bro's household, don't you, Chief?" said Gumbo. "That is, I'd like to see how you handle this sort of thing. I'll probably learn something from your way of handling things." Chief Roper knew what Danny Gumbo said was sheer flattery, but he liked it. He grinned at the big town detective. "Glad to have you work with me, Gumbo," he said. Then, as the doctor came up to them. "This is Danny Gumbo, Dr. Jacob." Jacob nodded and knelt beside the corpse. Finally he stood up. "Death by suffocation," he announced. "Doubtless from being buried under the sand." "I'm afraid you're wrong, doctor," said Gumbo. "Bro died of strangulation, not suffocation. If you look carefully at his throat, you'll see." Jacob uttered a startled exclamation and then examined the body again. "You're right, Mr. Gumbo," he said, his expression serious. "This is murder. My first examination was purely superficial. I didn't intend it as a final verdict." "How long would you say he has been dead, doctor?" asked Roper. "About 6 hours," Jacob said promptly. "Then he must have been killed at approximately 2:30 this morning," said Gumbo, glancing at his wrist watch. "It's 8:30 now." "That's right," said Jacob. He turned to Roper. "Will that be all, Chief?" Roper nodded. Then he glanced at the motorcycle policeman and motioned Mike to come closer. "Put the body in my car, Mike. I'll take it back to the village." Mike and 2 of the workmen lifted the corpse. As they did, something dropped to the ground. Bending quickly, Gumbo picked it up. Both Roper and Jacob looked at the object that Gumbo held in his palm. It was a gray-green stone about the size of a small walnut. "What is it?" asked Roper, as he frowned at the round object. "The most interesting thing we've found yet," said Gumbo, holding it between his forefinger and thumb for all to see. "It's an uncut diamond, and its value, I'd say at a rough guess, is at least $5,000. 3. Even in the bright sunlight of early morning, the huge old stone house on the estate called Ridgeway Manor was a bleak, drab-looking place that appeared to sag beneath the weight of its many years. The 6 acres of grounds that surrounded the house were dotted with big trees, their branches showing the first hint of green leaves. "So this is where Edwin Bro lived," said Danny Gumbo, as Roper drove his sedan along the winding drive that led to the old house. "Not a friendly-looking place, but then I don't believe the late Mr. Bro was friendly." "He wasn't," said Roper. "In fact, I know of at least 3 men right in this neighborhood who had every reason to hate him." "3 men," said Gumbo thoughtfully. "That's very interesting. Tell me more about them when we have time." Roper braked the car to a halt in front of the large porch, and he and Gumbo got out. The butler who opened the massive oak door of the house at their ring seemed surprised at seeing a uniformed police official. "Is Miss Bro at home, Shane?" asked the chief. Gumbo studied the butler with interest. Shane looked exceedingly husky, and there was something about his battered face that hinted he had spent considerable time in the prize ring. "Yes, Chief Roper," said Shane. "Miss Bro is home. Is it about her father?" "It is," stated Roper grimly. "He's been murdered." "Murdered?" Shane's face went gray and his hands clenched and unclenched. "I beg pardon, sir." The shock, he turned. If you'll come into the living room, I'll call Miss Marie." He ushered them into a large room off the hall and hurried away. Danny Gumbo frowned. Despite the attractive furnishings and the warming sunlight pouring in through the wide windows, there was a strange, depressing atmosphere about this house. It seemed to him that it was a place that had been dominated by hate ever since its existence. Evidently Chief Roper had the same sensation in a lesser degree, for both men remained silent, waiting in almost stolid stillness. Through the half-open windows they could hear birds twittering in a bird bath, but within the house it remained bleak and dismal. With a sense of relief, Gumbo heard quick footsteps approaching along the wall. Both men rose, but it was a man who entered the room and not the girl they had expected. He was young and blonde, with thick, wavy hair. To Gumbo he seemed too much like a juvenile actor making a carefully staged entrance. His deep-set eyes darted from the face of one man to the other as he closed the door behind him. "What did you tell Shane, Chief?" he asked. "What's wrong?" "Mr. Bro was murdered some time during the night, Mr. Dayton," answered Roper. "His body was found early this morning." Danny Gumbo had been a detective long enough to be a bit hard-boiled and cynical at times. He watched the blonde man, thinking. "That's your cue, my boy. Go to it. Turn on the histrionics." Drayton did not fail him. "Good God," he exclaimed dramatically. "Murdered. So that's what happened to him." "Were you expecting something to happen to him?" asked Gumbo. His words seemed to startle Dayton. He looked flustered, young and frightened for a moment. Then he recovered himself. "I beg your pardon," he said coldly. "But I don't believe we've met." It was all Gumbo could do to keep from laughing in his face. The sudden rush of dignity was so obviously to cover up the slip he had just made. "Sorry, Mr. Dayton," said Chief Roper dryly. "You didn't give me a chance to introduce you. Danny Gumbo Jimmy Dayton, Mr. Bro's secretary." Dayton bowed stiffly. Gumbo merely smiled. He remembered Roper had said Ridgeway Manor had once belonged to the Dayton family, and that was an angle to be considered. Bro's secretary might have had good reason to hate his boss if this had been young Dayton's former home. "What made you feel something had happened to Mr. Bro?" asked the chief suddenly. "It was only natural under the circumstances," said Dayton. "As a matter of fact, I've just been trying to phone the police station, but the storm must have damaged the telephone wires. About half an hour ago I took some letters up to Mr. Bro's room for him to sign. He usually stays in bed until noon. But I found his bed hadn't been slept in. When there was no sign of him around the place, naturally we grew anxious." "Did you know that he went out somewhere during the storm last night?" Gumbo asked. "Mr. Gumbo is a detective from New York who is helping me on this case," Roper explained as Dayton hesitated. "Oh, I see." Dayton looked intently at the husky, dark-haired man, then nodded. "About what you just asked, Mr. Gumbo, the answer is that I did not know Mr. Bro was away from the house last night. Would you mind telling me just what happened to him?" The chief briefly related the circumstances surrounding the finding of the body. "So somebody finally killed him," said Dayton. "I'm not surprised at all. Bro was cruel and ruthless. He loved to dominate those around him." The blond man smiled ironically. "That's why he gave me a job as his secretary after he had ruined my father financially and snatched this property away from us." "And your father?" asked Gumbo. "He killed himself," Dayton said stolidly. "So you see, gentlemen, I had plenty of reason to hate Edwin Bro to hate him enough to want to kill him. But I didn't. I wish I had though." "Why did you remain here as Bro's secretary if you hated him so much?" Gumbo asked. "After all, you didn't have to work for him." "It was because," Dayton broke off as the door opened and a girl came into the room. She was slim, and because of her slimness she looked taller than she really was. Her soft, dark hair gleamed blue-black in the sunlight pouring through the windows. An attractive girl, Irish type, Danny Gumbo thought, pretty but not beautiful. The nose was slightly too small, the blue eyes a trifle too far apart, the red mouth a bit too large for real beauty. But she had undeniable charm. "Miss Marie Bro," Roper said. "This is Mr. Gumbo, who is working with me. I'm afraid we've brought you sad news." "I know. Shane just told me." Her voice was low and husky. But there was no sign of grief on her face, only a look of anxiety in her eyes as she glanced at Dayton, as though seeking some message from him. There was apparently something comforting in his glance, for her attitude was composed as she motioned the three men to be seated and she took a chair. "You wish us to give you the details, of course," said Roper. "Naturally," she said. Her face remained perfectly expressionless as she listened to Roper's story. "What we are looking for is some kind of motive," Gumbo explained, when the chief had finished. This was apparently a crime that was not committed on the spur of the moment. Something brought Edwin Bro out into the storm last night. "The letter," said Dayton. "I just remembered it." "What letter?" asked Gumbo. "It arrived special delivery yesterday afternoon," said the secretary. He looked at the girl. "Don't you remember, Marie?" "Yes, Jimmy, of course," she said. "Father read it through twice, and then threw it into the fire." "Did you see the postmark?" Gumbo asked Dayton. "No, I didn't." Dayton rose. "But Shane must have signed for it. I'll get him. Perhaps he can tell us something." He stepped out into the hall, closing the door behind him. Gumbo again turned to the girl. "Perhaps you may know something regarding your father's life that will be a help, Miss Bro," he said. "Did he ever mention any enemies?" "I know very little about his life," Marie said softly. "He never made a confidant of anyone, least of all me. It may seem strange to you, but I hardly knew him. All of my girlhood was spent in a convent in France. During that time my father spent the years in big cities, like New York and Chicago. He was always generous toward me with money, but it was not until 4 years ago that he brought me to America. I was 17 then." "Your mother died when you were very young?" asked Gumbo. "Yes, when I was 7. That was when father placed me in the convent in France. Later we lived in a large house on the outskirts of Newark, and then we came here. For the first time she looked distressed. I've always hated this place because of the way father got the property from the Daytons. How was that? Father talked Mr. Dayton into investing heavily in a mining company. That failed. I don't know the details, but Mr. Dayton lost all of his money and his home. The shock was too much for him and he killed himself. Have you ever seen anything like this in your father's possession? Gumbo drew the small gray-green stone from his pocket and held it out to her. Never, Marie said. What is it? An uncut diamond, answered Gumbo. We found it on the ground near your father's body. From outside there came a sudden wild shout. Both Gumbo and Roper lumped to their feet. The girl rose hastily. Sounded as if it came from the hall, said Gumbo, hurrying to the door and throwing it open. This way, Chief. O stepped out into the hall, with Roper close behind him. Up the hall, Gumbo paused before a half-open door. Let's take a look in here. He opened the door wider, revealing a big dining room beyond. Dayton, what the devil? The blond young man was bending over the motionless figure of the butler sprawled on the rug. Something's happened to Shane. Dayton's tone was tense as he stood erect. I heard him shout and ran in here, and found him lying on the floor like this. Gumbo stepped forward, Roper kneeling beside the butler. There were red marks on the man's throat. Who did this, Dayton? Gumbo demanded. Somebody tried to strangle Shane. Did you see anyone? Yes, said Dayton. I did. As I came in, I saw a tall man with a black cloth hiding the Danny part of his face run out through that casement window there. Chief Roper went to the casement window. The two glass panels were closed. The chief tried the handle and then swung around. This window is locked, he said. And the key is missing. No man could have gone through this window. But he did, Dayton insisted. He did, I tell you. Gumbo started to speak, but at that moment Shane moaned and then began to mumble. Don't, Spike, muttered the butler. I didn't know about the big guy. Shane opened his eyes and stared blankly up at the faces surrounding him. Then he sat up weakly, and Gumbo and Roper helped him to his feet. I'm sorry, he said. I must have fallen and struck my head. The chief frowned and looked as if he intended to say something, but Gumbo caught Roper's eye and shook his head. You'll be all right now, Shane, said Gumbo, as they placed the butler in a chair. Just stay quiet for a while. He turned to Dayton. I wonder if we might look through Mr. Bro's private papers. Perhaps we'll find some help there. Of course, said the secretary. He kept them all in a cabinet in his study. Dayton led them along the hall to Bro's study. At Gumbo's suggestion, the chief left them to interview the 4 other servants, cook, maid, laundress and chauffeur. An inspection of the papers in the dead man's study proved futile. There were no private papers of any kind. What did you find? Asked Roper when he finally returned from questioning the servants. And then, when Gumbo told him. I didn't get much information. None of the servants have been with Bro longer than a year, and they know nothing about him. His only regular visitor was a man named Sledge, who lives in a cottage not far from here. Sledge? Exclaimed Dayton as he heard the name. That's it. Why didn't I think of him before? I don't know, said Gumbo quickly. But you do have a way of thinking of people and special delivery letters very conveniently. Go on, Dayton. What about Sledge? He's a writer, apparently an old friend of Bro's. He used to come here quite often in the evenings. But they must have quarreled about something. Anyway, I heard Sledge shout, I'll kill you for this. Then he rushed out of the house and hasn't been back since. Are you accusing Bill Sledge of murdering father? Marie Bro stood in the doorway of the study, staring at the blond man. Oh, Jimmy, I didn't think you'd let your jealousy get the best of you to this extent. Bill Sledge just couldn't be guilty. Suppose we visit Sledge, Gumbo suggested. 4. Danny Gumbo filled and lighted a pipe as he and Roper drove away in the chief's sedan. What do you think of this case now? Asked Roper. Too bad Shane didn't notice the postmark on that special delivery letter. He did seem evasive about it when we finally got around to questioning him, said Gumbo. Interesting household that, a butler who is obviously an ex-prize fighter and who speaks with a phony British accent until he is half-conscious after someone tries to strangle him. And then he talks like a mobster and mentions Spike and the big guy. That's right. The chief nodded. And a secretary who hated the man he worked for so bitterly that he wished he had killed him. Roper frowned. Dayton could have done it, at that. Why did he stay there if he hated Bro? Because of the girl. Gumbo paused, thinking things over. Then he nodded and went on. Jimmy Dayton could have tried to strangle Shane. There was plenty of time for him to do it. We must have talked to Marie for 15 or 20 minutes after he left us to go and find Shane. His story about hearing Shane shout and then rushing to the butler's aid sounded fishy to me, Roper agreed. Why didn't he go find Shane at once? Because Dayton was busy in the study destroying all of Bro's personal papers, Gumbo said. I'm sure of that. He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. And you were wrong when you said a man could not have left the dining room by that casement window. But the window was locked, Roper protested. Certainly, but you mentioned the fact that the key was missing. The window could have been locked from the outside as well as the inside. They were rolling along a stretch of country road now. Ahead was a small cottage set back among a group of trees. Roper brought the car to a stop in front of the place. Danny Gumbo looked at the drawn blinds as he and Roper got out and walked to the front door. Bill Sledge's cottage appeared to be deserted. There was no response from within the cottage as Roper used the brass knocker. He seems to be out, said Roper, turning away. Gumbo was about to follow when something on the edge of the door sill caught his eye. Wait, Chief, he said. He stooped and placed his finger on a small dark stain close up against the bottom of the door. What's the matter? Asked Roper. There's something wrong here. That's blood. Before Roper could speak, Danny Gumbo flung himself bodily at the front door. The flimsy lock parted finally under his smashing weight and the door crashed open. A man's body lay sprawled in the small hall. A little dark pool had collected around it, and the ugly hilt of a knife protruded from his chest, just above the heart. Good Lord, exclaimed Roper. It's Sledge. Gumbo knelt beside the body. Sledge had been a man in his early 30s, with a strong, hard face and thick black hair. He was dressed in shirt and trousers and there were bedroom slippers on his feet. Gumbo found that there was no pulse and the heart had stopped beating. He's still warm and just stopped bleeding, said Gumbo, getting to his feet. He hasn't been dead very long, perhaps not more than a few minutes. He looked grimly at the chief. The murderer may still be around somewhere. Right. Roper drew his gun from its holster. Come on, Gumbo. We'll take a look around. There were only 5 rooms in the cottage. They found no sign of anyone as they searched the place. At least there's one thing we know, said Roper. Neither Dayton nor Shane could have killed Sledge. They didn't have time to be in 2 places at once. Just for the sake of argument, suppose I say you're wrong, said Gumbo. It took us about 10 minutes to drive here from Bro's. Remember, you were driving fairly slowly while we discussed the case. We'll take it for granted that Dayton and Shane both can drive and could easily get hold of a car. We don't know where the butler went after he admitted us and told Dayton and the Bro girl we were there. Shane didn't commit this murder, protested the chief of police. Vic. I didn't say he did. I merely said he could have done it. Suppose he drove here, killed Sledge with a knife and then hastily drove back to Ridgeway Manor. He wants to attract our attention so he shouts, then presses his own fingers into his throat so it will look as if somebody tried to strangle him, and then fakes being unconscious. A perfect alibi. What about the man with the black cloth around the Danny part of his face that Dayton saw when he rushed into the dining room? Are we sure that Dayton really saw any such man? Gumbo smiled. After all, our blonde young friend loves to dramatize things. It would make it so much better if he dashed into Shane's rescue just in the nick of time. An insistent rapping sounded on the back door of the cottage. Gumbo went to the door and drew it open. A short, stocky man stood there, a look of fear on his ugly, grimy face. Thought I recognized your car, Chief, he said. I seen it from the distance as I was running across the field. He's after me, and I want you to lock me up so as he can't get me. He's gonna kill me. Who is going to kill you, Bentley? Demanded Roper. What are you talking about? Thomas Hernandez, said Bentley, trembling as he looked about him. He's the one who murdered Mr. Bro and now he's after me. Who is this man, Chief? Gumbo asked. Jim Bentley, answered Roper. He owns that old roadhouse, the Cedar Inn. And Bro's body was found not far from there, said Gumbo, turning to face Bentley. Who is Thomas Hernandez? Tell us what he looks like, Bentley.
I don't know, Bentley said.
I've never seen his face. Roper glared at him. You expect us to believe that? You got to believe it, Bentley pleaded. It's the truth. As you know, the roadhouse ain't been open to the public for a couple of years. I tried running the place, but it just didn't pay. So I just been living at the inn by myself. 2 or 3 nights ago, a guy comes there and asks me do I want to make a little dough. So I says I might be interested if it wasn't crooked. And just as interested if it did happen to be something outside the law, Gumbo decided as he sized up the stocky owner of the old Cedar Inn. Bentley looked as if he would be willing to enter into any sort of a crooked deal that did not require too much courage. This man who offered you money was Thomas Hernandez? Asked Gumbo, as Bentley paused. No, it wasn't. It was the guy who lived in this cottage, William Sledge. Sledge? Exclaimed Gumbo in surprise. Go on, Bentley. Well, this Sledge tells me that he has a couple of friends that are looking for a place to hold a private business talk. They ask Sledge to find a place for them, so he thinks of the inn and comes to see me about it. We made a deal. A guy named Hernandez is to come to my place and meet another feller. They're gonna talk over this big business deal or something. When was this supposed to take place? Asked Gumbo, as Bentley again stopped talking and looked around nervously. It was last night, said Bentley. This Thomas Hernandez shows up, and he's got a black handkerchief hiding the Danny part of his face. And his hat is pulled down so that you can't see nothing but his eyes. Hard-looking guy, he was, and when he told me to stick around and do as he says, I didn't argue with him none. Was he tall or short? Asked Gumbo. A tall guy. Close to 6 feet, I guess. Bentley broke off and stood gazing at the doorway leading from the kitchen into the hall of the cottage. His mouth was wide open. Both Gumbo and Roper swung around. Shane, the bro butler, stood there, a tall figure in the doorway, a somber expression on his battered face as he gazed at Bentley. I beg your pardon, gentlemen, Shane said. I heard voices, and so I came back here hoping to find you. What are you doing here, Shane? Asked Gumbo. I came here to find you and Chief Roper, sir, said the butler, still watching Bentley, who was gazing at him 63 with the fascination of a bird captured by a snake. There was something said about your going to Mr. Sledge's residence after you left Ridgeway Manor, so I took the liberty of borrowing one of the family's cars and driving here at once. Why? Gumbo snapped. Is there something wrong? I'm not certain, sir, said Shane. But Miss Marie appears to be missing. She's probably just gone out for a while, Roper said. I don't think we need worry about her in broad daylight, Shane. Where is Dayton? Maybe he knows where she is. But I don't, the blond young man said excitedly, as he stepped in through the back door of the cottage. I've been looking for her myself. So you thought she might be calling on Sledge, and came to the cottage by the back way so that you might be able to look in without being seen, said Gumbo. Is that it, Dayton? The blond man flushed, but did not answer. Unfortunately, Mr. Sledge has been murdered and Miss Bro is not here, Gumbo told the secretary. Sledge murdered, I exclaimed Dayton. Great. Forget the dramatics, Dayton, Gumbo said. We're not in the mood. I'm getting out of here, said Bentley nervously. I didn't know that Sledge guy had been killed. You didn't? Gumbo looked at the short, stocky man questioningly. Then, when you first mentioned Sledge a few minutes ago, why did you say, it was the guy who lived in this cottage? You spoke of him in the past tense, Bentley, as people usually do of the dead. Roper. Gumbo. Where the devil are you? A deep voice called from the front of the cottage. It's Jacob. Back here, Doc, shouted the chief. In the kitchen. If there is nothing further I can do, I'll be getting back to the estate, Shane said. Perhaps there might be some word from Miss Marie by now. All right, Shane, said Roper suspiciously. Go ahead. Phone me at police headquarters if you don't find her by afternoon. Very good, sir. Shane stepped out through the back door just as Dr. Jacob entered the kitchen. I saw your car outside, Chief, the doctor said, stroking his red mustache as he looked at the other men in the kitchen. Thought I'd stop and see if you had learned any more about Benson's murder. He scowled. But I didn't expect to find another corpse here. Neither did we, said Danny Gumbo dryly. He'll get me, shouted Jim Bentley suddenly. I recognized his voice. I know he'll get me. The short, stocky man gave Dayton a shove, and leapt for the back door of the cottage. Stop him, Gumbo shouted, darting outside after Bentley, with the others close behind him. He's the most important witness we have so far. From the front of the cottage came the sudden roar of a motor and then the meshing of gears as a car started. Gumbo rounded the corner just in time to see Bentley driving away in a low-slung speeding sport coupe. "Hey," shouted Dayton. "He's stealing my car." "Go after him, Chief," Gumbo said to Roper. "I'll stay here with the body. Take Dayton with you." Roper nodded and climbed into his car, with Dayton right after him. They sped away with the siren on the chief's car wailing. Gumbo and Jacob watched until the car disappeared from sight. Finally, the detective drew out his tobacco pouch and filled and lighted his pipe. "Complicated business, murder," he said. "Don't you think so, Doctor?" "Yes." Jacob nodded. "Shall I give you a report on Sledge's body?" V. As the doctor examined the corpse sprawled out on the floor, Gumbo leaned against the wall, watching. A patch of bright sunlight crept in through the door and seemed to halt in fright at the feet of the dead man. "I wouldn't touch it," Gumbo said, as Jacob reached out a hand to withdraw the black-handled knife from Sledge's heart. "Fingerprints, you know, though the murderer was doubtlessly too smart for that. He probably wore gloves." "Probably." The doctor got to his feet with a sigh. "As near as I can tell, he's been dead about an hour." "I don't think it's that long. He had just stopped bleeding when we found him," Gumbo pointed out. "Not more than 5 or 10 minutes before we arrived here." "Have it your way, if you wish." Dr. Jacob shrugged his shoulders. "Your guess as to when he died is as good as mine. There's nothing more I can do here now." They stepped through the front door and out into the bright sunlight. "Do you think this horrible crime has anything to do with the murder of Edwin Bro?" "Of course." Gumbo had removed his hat and he ran his fingers through his thick black hair. "Murder breeds murder, Doctor. At least I've often found it to be the case." "And the motive?" Gumbo looked hard at Jacob. "Did you like Bro, Doctor?" "I despised him," said Jacob. "That makes it practically unanimous," said Gumbo. "But the man who hated him the most was named Hernandez." "Never heard of him." The doctor looked puzzled. "Doesn't live around these parts, does he?" "I'm not sure he exists at all," said Gumbo. "It may be just a name the murderer is using to cover his real identity." "I marvel at the modem type of criminal investigator," remarked the doctor. "You have to be experts in so many things, like ballistics, fingerprinting. Take that murder case in New York a year or so ago, where a piece of cord was traced to the killer. Without warning, Gumbo flung himself at the doctor in a flying tackle that brought Jacob crashing to the ground. A bullet thudded into the side of the house. From the woods at the side of the cottage came what sounded like the crack of a .22 caliber rifle. Gumbo rolled quickly aside and whipped an automatic out of his shoulder holster. He fired at a figure running far back among the trees. "What's the idea, Gumbo?" snarled Jacob, getting to his feet. "Somebody doesn't like you, Doctor." Gumbo dropped the automatic back into the shoulder holster. "He tried to kill you with a rifle." The husky dark-haired detective picked up the hat he had dropped when he had leapt toward the doctor. "But who would want to kill me, and why?" Jacob exclaimed. "I don't know." Gumbo frowned. "But this complicates things greatly." "Why?" Jacob looked puzzled. "Because up to now you've been one of my best possible suspects, Doctor." Gumbo grinned. "Your carelessness in reporting the time that Bro and Sedgwick died seemed like an alibi to me." "Rot!" snorted the doctor. "You're crazy, Gumbo." He moved toward his car. "But I'm glad you got that idea off your mind. You'll find me at my office if you need me." Calmly smoking his pipe as Jacob drove away in his mud-spattered roadster, Gumbo searched the woods beyond the cottage. It was possible the man with the rifle might sneak back through the trees, and Gumbo was not at all sure the shot he had fired had even winged the killer. "Guess I really am foolish to stay out in the open like this," he said to himself. "I must make a nice target." He stepped in through the front door of the cottage, pausing in the hall to look down at the corpse. The casual murder investigation routine of the Stoneville Police Department worried him. He missed the checking by the fingerprint experts, the work of the police photographers, and even having a guard at the spot where the body had been found. Compared to the usual thorough examination and report given by a city police medical examiner, the way Dr. Jacobs had handled things regarding the 2 dead men was a joke. Probably, as Chief Roper had said, the doctor was a good man as a general practitioner, but in Gumbo's estimate Jacob wasn't worth a damn as a coroner. There were a lot of angles to this case running through Gumbo's head. He tried to arrange the facts as he knew them in some logical order. First, Sledge had come to the old roadhouse and made arrangements with Bentley for the Cedar Inn to be used as a meeting place between Bro and the mysterious Thomas Hernandez. In Gumbo's estimation, there was a false note right there. Why should two men go to all that trouble to arrange a meeting place? He said, thinking aloud. And why was it necessary for Sledge, a third party, to make the arrangements? He could think of only one reason, and that was that Hernandez had planned to murder Bro from the beginning. In that case, had Sledge known of the killer's intention and been working with him? Was that why Sledge had been murdered, because he knew too much? The whole thing was screwy. The little cottage was hushed and still now. The door of the living room that opened out into the hall was closed. Silently, Gumbo opened it. He stood there with his hand on the knob, his eyes fixed on the broad back of the man who was crouched beside a little wall safe. "Find anything interesting there, Shane?" Gumbo said as his right hand slid to the automatic in his shoulder holster. Bro's butler swung around with a snarl. He leapt toward Gumbo even as the detective drew his gun. Before Gumbo could aim the gun, Shane smashed a hard fist against his chin. The blow sent Gumbo reeling back against the wall of the living room with such impact that he jarred the whole cottage. A blinding flash of pain swept over him as his elbow struck the wall, numbing his arm so that the automatic dropped from his fingers. "You ain't gonna get me." All trace of Shane's soft English accent was gone now. Gumbo did not waste any breath on words. The pain in his left arm passed as quickly as it had come. He advanced toward Shane, throwing aside a small table that stood in the center of the room. Shane's eyes gleamed as he saw Gumbo hastily throw off his coat and assume the professional stance of a trained boxer. This looked as if it would be right up the ex-prizefighter's alley. "One of them college boy champs, eh?" said Shane sarcastically. "Well, I can take care of you." He whipped out a left, and Gumbo rode with the blow. Another left, and Gumbo swayed to the right. Then Gumbo came charging in fast, rocking Shane with 4 quick lefts to the chin. The butler was tough, and it was evident that he didn't have a glass jaw. Those 4 wallops of Gumbo's had plenty of power behind them, but Shane shrugged them off and came back swinging. Then Gumbo swung a right that connected with Shane's chin and the butler went down. Gumbo was too experienced a fighter to stand there admiring his handiwork. He snatched up his automatic from where it had fallen. Shane moaned and sat up, looking miserable when he saw Gumbo had him covered with the gun. "Now you be a good boy while I see what you were after," said Gumbo. He backed to the open door of the wall safe and, without taking his eyes off Shane, drew out a flat case. "A jewel box," he said. He stepped to a table in one corner of the room and opened the case with one hand. "So this is why you murdered Bro and Sledge?" "I didn't kill them," Shane protested, struggling to his feet. "Why should I murder the boss? He was a good guy, and smart too. I'll bet there never was a better international crook than Edwin Bro." "International crook? Is that true, Shane?" "Sure it's true. But Bro gave it up about 10 years ago. That was when he brought his daughter home from that convent in France. Since then we've been going straight." Shane frowned. "But when I think of the way the boss used to get away with smuggling stuff into this country, and the big deals he put across, it makes me sad." "So you decided to try your hand at a little crooked work yourself?" Still covering Shane with his gun, Gumbo glanced at the contents of the jewel box. Arranged in neat rows were a glittering and oddly cut diamond, a ruby, a star sapphire, 2 or 3 smaller stones, and a single uncut diamond. "Nice little haul, this. Too bad you didn't get away with it, Shane." "It is," Shane said. He had regained control of himself, and once more his voice was suave and accented and he was careful of his English. "Unfortunately Mr. Bro's death was so unexpected that he made no provision for me. I knew that Mr. Sledge had a small collection of rather valuable jewels, so I thought I had better try and feather my nest." "So you murdered Sledge," Gumbo said. "But we got here too quickly for you to have a chance to steal the gems." "No," Shane said. "I didn't kill Sledge. He was dead when I first came here looking for you and the chief a little while ago." "All right, we'll let it go that way for the time being," said Gumbo. "But what about the big deals that Bro used to put over? Was Sledge connected with any of them?" "I believe he was mixed up in Mr. Bro's last bit of smuggling," said Shane thoughtfully. "There were quite a lot of rich people implicated in that, as I recall. A New York bank president, Dillard, I believe his name was, and Sledge and some other men. Mike Dillard, president of the Financial Trust Company? Yes, that's the man. Good. I know Dillard very well. He may be able to tell me something about that smuggling deal you mention. Gumbo dropped his automatic back into his pocket. I'm going to surprise you, Shane. How so, sir? Shane was once more the placid butler. I'm going to let you go. Of course, I could turn you over to Chief Roper and have him jail you for attempted theft. But that would be merely your word against mine, sir, said Shane. After the next all, I have not touched that jewel case. Only your fingerprints are on it, along with those of Mr. Sledge. Gumbo grinned. Shane was right. It was his word against Gumbo's, and probably his fingerprints were actually not on the jewel case, as he said. Then a sudden thought occurred to him. You didn't have time to go back to the Bro estate, Gumbo said. Where did you go after you drove away from here? Then he banged the wall safe shut. You just came here to see if I had learned anything further about Miss Bro. His tone was suddenly hard. But I wouldn't try to leave this part of the country, if I were you. Very good, sir. Shane picked up Gumbo's overcoat and held it out for him. Your coat, Mr. Gumbo. For an instant, Gumbo hesitated. Once he thrust his arms into the sleeves of that coat, it would give Shane a perfect chance. I drove around the bend to the south, parked the car and came back through the woods on foot, said Shane. I came in the back door, of course. I heard you shooting, and then everything was quiet. I was sure you were chasing someone when I heard a car drive away. The butler rubbed the chin that Gumbo had pounded heavily. I made a mistake. Then you don't know if Miss Bro is still missing? Gumbo asked. No, sir, I don't. Shane looked at the detective then, as they heard a car stop out in the road. There's somebody coming. What shall I do? Nothing. Gumbo closed the jewel case and dropped it into a side pocket of his opportunity to capture him. He glanced at the ex-prizefighter. Then he smiled and let Shane help him on with the garment. Thank you, Shane, he said as he walked away. The butler bowed and followed the detective out into the hall, picking up the hat Gumbo had dropped and handing it to him. Chief Roper came barging in through the front door. There were 3 policemen with him. Gumbo saw that Jimmy Dayton was no longer with the chief. Bentley got away, said Roper excitedly. We chased him about a quarter of a mile along the road, then he turned into a drive leading to an old farm. He left Dayton's car there and struck out through the woods. He had too much of a head start for us to chase after him on foot, so I went back to the village to get some of my men. I'll have them search this area for Bentley. He's around here somewhere. Glad you got back, Chief, Gumbo said, yawning. It's been pretty dull around here just guarding the corpse. He glanced at the butler. Hasn't it, Shane? Quite so, sir, said Shane without the slightest change of expression. Dull is the word. Vi. Moonlight cast a silver sheen on the stately trees of Ridgeway Manor, and yet there were many places where the light did not penetrate. From beneath the weeping willow tree back near the garage, a tall man loomed into view. A soft hat was pulled low on his forehead so that only the glittering eyes above the black cloth hiding the Danny part of his face were visible. His overcoat collar was turned up, though the night was not cold. A corpse lay at his feet. I warned him not to talk, he muttered. Babbling all he knew to the chief and that detective. The man called Thomas Hernandez went to a tall flagpole that was set on the lawn. He unfastened one end of the halyard and carried the rope back with him to the weeping willow. Quickly fashioning a noose, he dropped it around the neck of the corpse. Jim Bentley would never speak out of turn again. The murderer worked fast, and when he had finished, a dead man was hanging from the flagpole on the estate that had belonged to Edwin Bro. That will puzzle them, Hernandez said as he moved quickly away into the enveloping darkness. The masked man did not see the plain handkerchief that dropped out of the side pocket of his coat. It was still there, a tiny patch of white in the moonlight long after he had disappeared. The car's headlights were like round white eyes as the automobile rolled along the winding drive that led to the front of the mansion. For an instant, the hanging corpse was clearly visible in the bright glare of the headlights. The car halted abruptly. Good Lord, exclaimed Roper. Look there, Gumbo. A man hanging from that flagpole. I see him. Gumbo opened the door and stepped out, Roper sliding from under the wheel. Looks like Bentley from here. The chief of police fumbled in the pocket of the car and produced a long-barreled flashlight. He switched the light on as they approached the pole. The white beam revealed the contorted face of the owner of the old Cedar Inn. "It's Jim Bentley, all right," said Roper. Deftly, Danny Gumbo unfastened the ropes and lowered the body to the ground. There were times when he hated his job, the close contact with death that murder cases frequently made necessary. He had to be callous, but in spite of everything, Bro, Sledge and Bentley had been human beings. Probably they had loved life as much as any man. Suddenly something white fluttered in the breeze, catching his eye. Gumbo went over and picked it up. It was a man's white linen handkerchief. And he noticed that it had a faintly sulfurous, chemical odor. "Find something?" Roper asked, moving closer and peering at the object in the detective's hand. "Just a man's handkerchief. No initials on it." Gumbo thrust the square of white linen into his pocket. "Might be some latent prints on it, though." "Too bad that my men didn't find Bentley," Roper said. "He would have been safer in jail, poor devil. At least we know where he is now." Gumbo's tone was bitter. But why did Hernandez have to be so spectacular about this? Hanging Bentley on the flagpole is such a childish trick. The sort of prank a college student might play with a stuffed dummy of the dean. He uttered a startled exclamation as he realized what he had said. "That's it, Chief. I was right." "Right about what?" Roper demanded. "We better hurry up. Remember, the reason we came here is because Dayton phoned and told us Marie Bro is still missing." His voice was tense as a thought struck him. "Do you suppose she might have been murdered?" "I doubt it," Gumbo said. "But when I said I was right a moment ago, I thought I had a line on the murderer. Now I'm not so sure of it. This afternoon you said you knew of 3 men who had reason to hate Edwin Bro. Who were they?" "Just local tradesmen. A butcher, a grocer and a man who runs a hardware store in the village. They all had arguments with Bro at one time or another. He had a nasty disposition." The chief sighed. "But they had no real motive for killing him." "The murderer did, I'm sure of that." "Stay here," Roper said suddenly. "I'm going into the house and phone for some of my men. I guess I'd better have Doc Jacob give us a report on the body." "That will be nice," Gumbo called out as the chief hurried toward the house. "He'll probably tell us Bentley died from natural causes 2 days ago." Roper laughed, then faded into the shadows as he passed beneath the overhanging branches of some trees. Gumbo stood beside the corpse, looking at the big house looming dimly in the night. There were lights shining through the windows on the Danny floor, bright squares set in the gray stone. Gumbo agreed with the chief. The 3 local men who hated Bro because of his disagreeable disposition were not even worthy of consideration as suspects in this case. There were others far more important. Jimmy Dayton had far more reason for killing the man who had ruined his father financially and caused the elder Dayton to kill himself. Shane might also be the murderer, for Gumbo had not accepted the butler's story without some reservations. "What the hell?" Gumbo muttered as the lights in the house went out, leaving the windows black blotches in the gloom. "That's strange. Maybe I better go see what's wrong." He ran across the lawn, drawing his automatic as he reached the steps of a small porch leading to the kitchen. The kitchen door was standing open, but the room beyond it was in total darkness. Danny Gumbo stopped when he saw that the cover of a small, square box built on the wall of the house was open. He produced a pocket flashlight. Just as he had thought, it was the fuse box that controlled the house's electricity. The main switch had been pulled open, cutting off all the lights. So that was it. Gumbo reached up and pushed the switch back into place. The instant he did so, a bright light gleamed through the open kitchen door. He stepped into the house. There was no one in the kitchen. Gumbo went through the butler's pantry and on into the dining room beyond. Electric lights were now burning all over the Danny floor, but even in the bright glow the dismal atmosphere of the place remained. "Wonder what happened to Chief Roper?" Gumbo muttered, as he searched the rooms and found them empty. The phone caught his eye when he stepped into what had been Edwin Bro's den. The instrument was lying on the desk, as though whoever had been using it had dropped it suddenly. Gumbo picked it up. As he did, a weird wailing, like a loudspeaker gone crazy, burst from his phone. Gumbo grinned and placed the phone back on the cradle. He knew that the operator had turned on the howler when she had found that the line was open and received no answer. The howler was often used when someone accidentally left their receiver off the hook. "Hello? Stoneville operator?" Gumbo asked after he had picked up the phone and heard the operator speak. "Did you just have a call over this wire? Were you calling 911? The operator asked. "That's the police department." "That's right. Seeing Roper's blue uniform cap lying on the floor beside the desk, Gumbo scowled. "Let me have them again, please." As soon as he got the police on the wire, Gumbo said that he was calling for Chief Roper, who wanted some men sent out to Ridgeway Manor right away and to come ready for trouble. There had been another murder. There was no longer any doubt in his mind that something had happened to Roper while he had been phoning the police station. But what? The only sign of a struggle was the cap lying on the floor, and the fact that the phone had evidently been put down suddenly. He walked toward the door with the intention of exploring the rest of the house. As he reached the door, the phone rang. He turned back to answer it. But at that moment someone leapt at him from the hall and a hard object crashed down on his head. Gumbo tried to fight back, but he felt himself slipping fast into unconsciousness. 7. Gumbo blinked and opened his eyes. He wondered vaguely why he was numb with cold and had such a racking pain in his head. He stretched out his hand into the velvety darkness that surrounded him and shivered as his groping fingers encountered cold, slimy earth. "I phoned the police," he muttered. "Phone rang and somebody must have hit me over the head and knocked me out when I turned to answer it." He struggled to a sitting position. The pain in his head made him wince, but presently the ache subsided somewhat. Who had struck him, and where had he been taken? He was sure he was no longer near Ridgeway Manor. He felt in his pockets, but the flashlight and his automatic were not there. If it was the murderer, why didn't he kill me instead of knocking me out and bringing me here? Gumbo asked himself, and then lapsed into silence as he found his own voice eerie, coming out of the black darkness. He felt in his vest pocket for the small cigarette lighter he usually carried, flicked it on as he got to his feet. In the dull glimmer of flame he peered about him. "Repulsive-looking place," he murmured. He was in a small, low-roofed cellar, apparently hollowed out of the earth itself, for the walls were slimy with the percolated moisture of years. His shoes splashed in an inch of foul water, and the air was so close and fetid that the flame of the lighter burned but dimly. Gumbo shivered. The only way to escape the water underfoot was a flight of wooden steps leading up to a pair of cellar doors, and even these steps were soggy and rotting like seaweed. He looked down at himself. His hat and overcoat were covered with green, slimy mud. The pain in his head was making him feel sick, and he sat for a moment or two on the steps. He discovered that he still had his pipe and tobacco pouch, so he filled and lighted the briar and smoked steadily in the black silence. "I guess the next thing is to try and get out of here." He rose to his feet, snapped on the lighter again and examined the cellar doors, which apparently formed the entrance and exit to this mud box into which he had been thrown. The doors fitted into a 6-inch frame of cement which in its turn was embedded in solid earth. A test of the heavy door proved they were immovable. Not a chance of getting out that way, he decided. And the roof of the cellar here at the door must be 18 inches thick. What I need is a steam shovel. On further investigation he found what seemed to be a weak patch in the roof near the hinged side of one of the doors. Some of the earth forming the roof had crumpled away at this point. Gumbo searched through the pockets, found a clasp knife and drew it out. He wondered why whoever had knocked him out had taken the gun and the flashlight and not the knife, and then decided they had probably reasoned it would not be used as a weapon. Opening the blade of the knife, he mounted the steps and began digging away at the loose earth. He had to work in the dark, but every now and then he snapped on the lighter and inspected his progress. "I'll probably be at this as long as the Abbé Faria in the Count of Monte Cristo was in digging that tunnel," Gumbo muttered. "But it's better than sitting around in the dark doing nothing." Despite his self-jesting, Gumbo knew the need for haste was urgent. Both Chief Roper and Marie Bro had disappeared. Even now they might be in the hands of the ruthless killer who called himself Thomas Hernandez. "What the hell?" Gumbo exclaimed, as a strange sound came to his ears. Water coming in here from somewhere. He went down the steps and stepped into water that was now up above his ankles. It had risen 4 inches higher over the cellar floor while he had been digging the hole near the door. With the aid of the pocket lighter he found the place where the water poured into his prison. It was a drain pipe set in the cellar wall, but now, instead of letting the water out, it was bringing more and more in. "So this is why he knocked me out and left me down here. When the water rises high enough, I drown. And it might be a long, long time before my body will be found." The water was coming in with too much force for any attempt to stop it by stuffing something in the drain, for the pipe was already half under water. There was only one thing to do, and that was to try and dig his way out as quickly as possible. He splashed back through the water and climbed the steps. He raised the lighter and the flame grew dim and then died away altogether. "Damn it!" he swore. Fuel's gone. He took off his overcoat and hat so he would be able to work faster, and began digging feverishly above his head with the knife. The water rushing into the cellar was a steady, sinister sound. Soon the job became no more than the continuous circling of the knife in the hole that he had already made. Slowly it was becoming larger. He was standing on one of the steps, for it was not much of a reach from there for a tall man. He felt the water creeping up until it was on a level with the tread of the step, then above it, so that it washed around the soles of his shoes. Coming in faster, Gumbo said. He must have turned a hose into that drain pipe. He continued his work and suddenly came upon a stumbling block. The roof evidently formed the floor of some room above, for he found that the earth had been reinforced with lines of wooden rafters. He was digging a hole about 18 inches in diameter and he scraped away until he had laid the rafters bare. The water was up to his thighs now, even though he had climbed as far up the steps as it was possible and still be able to work with any degree of comfort. Then he began the slow and painful task of hacking through the timber. The wood that had been buried in the damp earth for years was not the tough, resilient stuff it had been when the builders had first sunk it there. Age had sapped its fibers, dampness had decayed it, but it was still far from being completely rotted. Gumbo's wrist ached thoroughly. His fingers had gone dead from gripping the slim knife handle, and his arms throbbed with the effort of holding them continuously above his head, but he stuck to his task. At the end of an hour the water was up to his waist, but one section of the timber had fallen and another was half hacked through. But there were still 2 more to be dislodged. "Wonder whether it's night or day," he muttered, as he paused briefly to rest. He didn't know how long he'd been knocked out or lay on the cellar floor. He found that he was forced to work in spells, digging for a few minutes and then again resting his arms. He knew that no matter how tired he might be, he had to get the hole dug through before the water rose much higher. If not, he would be unable to continue, for once it rose as high as the roof he would drown. Then suddenly Gumbo broke through. He could feel air rushing through the place where the knife had dug open a little, but reassuring hole. Thank God. He breathed, working frantically to make the hole larger. He tugged at the 2 remaining rafters and finally they fell, leaving an opening wide enough for him to crawl through. Well, here goes. A dim light gleamed through the opening. Gumbo was about to reach up and pull himself through the hole when he heard footsteps above. He stood there in the darkness, the chill water up to his neck, listening tensely. After all the work he had done, were his efforts going to be in vain? Would the murderer find him before he was able to get free? The footsteps above came closer. Whoever was walking up there was close to the edge of the hole and must certainly see it. To Gumbo's surprise, the footsteps stopped and there followed a creaking sound and then a long sigh. "That's better, now that I have removed the gag," said a gruff, apparently disguised masculine voice. "What am I doing here?" came the husky whisper of Marie Bro. The broken sentence ended in a little scream. "You have nothing to fear," said the voice of the murderer. "If you'll give me the information I want, no one will harm you." "Information?" Marie Bro's voice was stronger and steadier. "What can I tell you? Who are you, anyway? Why are you hiding your face with that black handkerchief?" "Never mind who I am. What I want to know is what your father did with the diamonds." The water was getting higher and higher. It was almost up to Gumbo's neck, yet if he tried to climb out through the hole the killer would discover him at once. In that case, he'd die before he even had a chance to aid the girl. "Where are the diamonds?" Hernandez repeated. "Tell me." "Diamonds?" Marie sounded puzzled. "What diamonds?" "Quit stalling. Your father had 300 uncut diamonds that he managed to smuggle into this country." "Smuggle?" Marie said. "You mean that my father was a famous international crook?" Hernandez finished for her. "Do you expect me to believe that you didn't know?" "Of course I didn't," the girl protested. "So that was why he never told me anything about his life during those years I spent at the convent. I understand why now." Her tone was bitter. "My father a smuggler." "I didn't come here to listen to you moan about your father's past," Hernandez said. "Where did he keep the diamonds?" "I killed 3 men because I wanted those stones, and put 3 more where they can't do any harm tonight." His voice had grown sinister. "I might make you the 4th victim if you don't tell me. Where are those diamonds?" "I don't know." Marie's tone had changed. She was frightened now. Danny Gumbo could sense the hysteria in her voice. "Father never told me about the diamonds. He never told me anything. You must believe that." He had heard enough. He reached up and dragged himself up through the opening he had dug between the ceiling of the cellar and the floor of the room above. In doing so, his head came into violent contact with an unseen object above. It was such a heavy blow that it nearly knocked him back through the hole into the water below. It took him a few seconds to recover, and then he realized he had struck his head on some metal springs 2 feet above his head. He had excavated the hole by sheer chance right under a bed on which he was sure Marie Bro was now bound. "What was that?" Hernandez said suddenly. "I heard a noise. Sounded as if it came from below," he chuckled. "Gumbo is down there. He can't get out, and water is pouring in around him higher and higher." "You fiend," Marie cried. "You murdering beast." "Careful, my dear," Hernandez said. "Perhaps you may remember this from your school days, a verbis ad verbera." "It sounds like Latin." "It is," said Hernandez. "And it means from words to blows. You really shouldn't call me names, my dear. I'll be back in a little while, and then I expect you to tell me where your father hid the diamonds." Gumbo had been silently waiting beneath the bed, most of the water seeping out of his clothes. The room was dimly lighted and he could see very little from where he was sprawled close to a side wall. He caught a glimpse of a pair of feet moving away and a length of leather strap as Hernandez walked toward the door. Hernandez was carrying that strap, apparently as a threat to the girl. Then he was gone, closing the door behind him. For a few moments Gumbo waited, then crawled out from under the bed and looked about him. He was in a low, dirty cellar, the comers of which were stacked with barrels and empty bottles. It was evidently the storage cellar of the Cedar Inn. The walls were of rough brickwork and the low ceiling was formed by the rafters of the floor above. An oil lamp stood on an old, cracked mirror bureau that stood in one corner. Gumbo turned to the bed, which was covered by a filthy blanket that trailed on the floor on both sides of the old iron bedstead. And on this lay Marie Benson, her wrists and ankles bound to the head and bottom rails of the bed by long strips of adhesive tape. Her face was deathly white, and across her forehead was a long gash from which blood had oozed and dried on her cheek. Her eyes were wide as she gazed at the water-soaked figure that had just crawled out from beneath the bed. "Don't scream," Gumbo said sharply. "I'm a friend. You know me, Miss Bro." "Danny Gumbo," she said. "Oh, thank heaven, you got here. He's coming back to kill me if I don't tell him where to find the diamonds. And I don't know, I tell you. I don't know." 8. Hernandez might return at any moment. Gumbo motioned the girl to be quiet and went to the door. He found it locked from the outside. It was built of stout oak, and he realized that even if he did succeed in battering it down, the noise would attract Thomas Hernandez. "What's the matter?" Marie's voice was low as she regained control of herself. "He locked the door," Gumbo answered, swiftly searching the cellar for some other means of escape. "We can't get out of here." In one corner were the sub-cellar doors, secured by a heavy oak bar, leading into the mud hole from which he had escaped. He wondered how soon the mud hole would be filled with water and the floods start rising into this cellar. "What are we going to do?" Marie asked, as Gumbo went to the bed and cut through the adhesive tape that bound her. She sat up, the dim light gleaming on her hair. "There's only one thing to do," Gumbo said. "He doesn't know I've escaped from down below. I'll hide under the bed again, and next time he comes in here, I'll be ready for him." Gumbo slid beneath the bed, hidden by the edge of the blanket that was draped over the side. At his order the girl told him her story in a voice so low it was little more than a whisper. That morning, after Gumbo and Chief Roper had told her of her father's murder, she had taken her roadster and driven into the village. She had remained a little while at the undertaker's establishment where the police had taken the body of her father. Then she had decided to drive out to the spot where the body had been found. "I felt I simply couldn't go back to that gloomy old house yet," she went on. "Jimmy would be there, Mr. Dayton, I mean, and so would Shane and the other servants. I didn't want their sympathy. I couldn't bear it. You see, Mr. Gumbo, I had found that my father's death left me without the slightest sensation of the real grief I should have felt." "That was natural," Gumbo said. "After all, your father was practically a stranger. But never mind that. Tell me what happened." "I reached the spot where the workmen were building the gasoline station," she said. "Then I changed my mind about stopping there. So I drove on. Finally I found myself in front of the old Cedar Inn. I wanted to find some place where I could be alone, to think things through." "You went into the inn?" "Yes. And the moment I stepped inside, someone grabbed me. Strong, horrible fingers caught me by the throat. Then something struck me on the head and I partially lost consciousness. I dimly realized someone was carrying me down into this dark, musty old cellar. Then some bitter-tasting stuff was forced down my throat. It made me feel ill, and then everything went black. And when you opened your eyes, the masked man was standing beside you, and you were tied to the bed. Gumbo asked. Is that it? Yes, said Marie. He was. Quiet. Gumbo interrupted. I hear footsteps. He's coming back. The sound of footsteps could be heard plainly as someone stopped outside the door. A clanking noise followed as a bolt was drawn back and the heavy door opened. Hernandez entered the cellar room. He wore his soft hat drawn low over his eyes and as usual the bottom half of his face was concealed beneath a piece of black material. Good thing I turned off the water, he said, glancing at the floor. The room's filled down there, and the whole inn would have been flooded if I'd let that hose on any longer. He approached the bed. With his overcoat collar turned up, he was a tall, sinister figure in the dim light of the oil lamp. He stood there glaring at the girl, who was lying on the bed as though she were still helplessly tied. Well, have you changed your mind? He asked. Are you going to tell me where the diamonds are hidden? How can I tell you? Marie said. I don't know anything about them. This is your last chance. Tell me. I don't know. I never heard, she broke off with a little cry as the masked man leaned forward, his fingers reached for her throat. You'll speak if I have to choke it out of you. Beneath the bed, Gumbo slightly raised the edge of the grimy blanket. He found that Hernandez's feet were within a foot of him. Suddenly he grabbed the ankles and gave a quick jerk. The masked man shouted as he was pulled off balance. He fell, striking the dirt floor with a thud that jarred the breath out of him. Gumbo crawled swiftly from under the bed. He was on his feet when Hernandez sprang up and hurled himself savagely at him. They went down together, rolling over and over, each clawing at the other. Marie sat up on the bed, no longer pretending she was bound. A fist slammed against Gumbo's chin, jerking his head back. He caught Hernandez's arm and then rolled over, smashing against the old bureau and knocking the lamp over. The chimney glass broke, but the wick continued to burn. Look out! Marie screamed. He's got an axe. Gumbo made it to his feet, ducked as Hernandez swung at him with a long-handled axe he had picked up from among the boxes and barrels. Gumbo caught the axe handle as Hernandez drew it back for another swing. Drop it, he shouted, tugging on the axe handle and smashing a fist into Hernandez's face at the same time. The blow knocked Hernandez back. He lost his grip on the axe so suddenly that it also flew out of Gumbo's hand and smashed into a cask of whiskey, tearing a hole in it. The liquor poured out and a bright flash of flame seared as the burning wick of the oil lamp ignited the whiskey. Fire! Marie screamed. The whole place will burn. Hernandez lashed out with a right and a left that sent Gumbo crashing down. Before he could regain his feet, the masked man had leapt to the door, slammed it shut from the outside, and shot the bolt into place. Getting to his feet, Gumbo commanded. Over by the door. The fire hasn't spread in that direction yet. He grabbed up an empty box and rushed to the double doors of the sub-cellar. He drew back the bolts that held them closed and flung the doors open. Just as he had hoped, the water had risen high enough for him to reach down and scoop up some of it in the box. He dashed the water on the fire, and part of the flames hissed and went out. I'll help, said Marie, picking up a tin basin from the floor. She scooped up water as Gumbo filled the soap box a second time. They worked fast, flinging water on the fire until it was completely extinguished. Then they found themselves in complete darkness. We're still trapped, Marie said. He bolted the door. There may be a way of getting out. Gumbo was fumbling around in the dark. Here, I've found the axe. The handle is scorched but still usable. He swung the axe against the door, smashing the keen blade through the panel so that he was able to reach through the hole he made and pull back the bolt. Carrying the axe, he stepped out of the cellar room. Marie Bro followed him. The old inn was quiet and appeared deserted now. They found a flight of stairs leading to the first floor of the place and climbed them, groping their way through the darkness. The cold night air felt good on their faces when, finally, they stepped outside. They walked along the road. Lovely place, the Cedar Inn, Gumbo said, glancing back at the squat building behind them. Marie laughed softly. My car is gone, of course, she said. I left it parked in front of the inn. But the killer wouldn't have left it there after he had taken me prisoner. Gumbo liked her. She was able to think for herself. But where would Hernandez take your car? You said it was a convertible, didn't you? Yes. Chartreuse with a black top. Which would make it as inconspicuous as a neon sign around here, Gumbo said. If you were the murderer and wanted to keep that car from arousing any suspicion around Stoneville, what would you do with it? Put it back where it belonged, in the garage at Ridgeway Manor. That is, if I could do it without being seen. You're wonderful, Gumbo said. That is what Hernandez must have done. Headlights gleamed far down the road ahead of them. The lights grew larger and brighter. They waited, standing in the shadows at the side of the road. It could be him, coming back, Marie said. Yes, I know. From the approaching car there came the high wail of a police siren. They recognized the sedan. It was Chief Roper's car. Gumbo stepped out into the white glare of the headlights, waving his arms. The sedan came to a halt with a grinding of brakes. Roper and Jimmy Dayton stepped out. Marie, darling, Dayton exclaimed as he rushed to the girl. Are you all right? These past few hours have been utter agony. Danny Gumbo stood there, still feeling the chill of the water in the sub-cellar, his arms aching from the work he had done. Step over here, Chief, he said, taking Roper and leading him away from Dayton and the girl. What happened to you? I left you to phone my men, Roper said. Just as I picked up the phone, the lights in the house went out. Someone knocked me out in the dark. When I came out of it I found that I had been locked in a clothes closet. I pounded on the door and my men heard me. They had arrived by then, so they let me out. Where were Dayton and Shane? They had been out looking for Miss Bro and just returned after the police got there, Roper said. But what happened to you, Gumbo? That's a long story. Gumbo turned toward the car. Suppose I tell it to you on the way back to the village, Chief. He glanced at Marie and Dayton. After we have taken those two home. By the way, it might be a good idea to station some of your men at Ridgeway Manor. Miss Bro's a great girl. I'd hate to have anything happen to her while I'm in New York tonight. New York, exclaimed Roper. Why are you going there? To see a man about a murderer, Gumbo answered. He frowned and glanced at Dayton and the girl. And don't ask me any more about it now. 9. It was a decidedly different-looking Danny Gumbo from the water-soaked mud-stained figure of the night before who entered the private office of Mike Dillard, president of the Financial Trust Company in New York. Gumbo had showered and shaved, and was wearing a new topcoat and hat to replace those he had lost in the sub-cellar of the old roadhouse. Good morning, Mike, he said, as the banker rose and shook hands with him warmly. I realize your time is valuable, so I'll get right to the point. Wait a minute, Danny. Dillard was a stout, bald man. He handed Gumbo a cigar. What's on your mind? Did you ever hear of an international criminal named Edwin Bro? No, of course not, Dillard said hastily. Careful, Mike. Gumbo's tone was serious. I've checked up on the police records and the newspapers of 10 years ago. That was around 1940. You and 4 other men were foolish enough to think that you could have Bro smuggle some jewels in from Europe for you so you'd get out of paying duty on them. That's right. Mike Dillard nodded shamefacedly. It was just sort of an adventure, proving that we were smarter than the government men. But we were caught. I paid the duty on the stuff that Bro brought in for me. It cost me $40,000, and I just managed to keep from receiving a jail sentence. As you say, there were 4 others mixed up in it. Do you remember the names of those 4 men? Gumbo smiled. This is strictly off the record, of course. Why, yes. One was Billy Sledge. Another was Thornton Dayton. Thornton Dayton? Interrupted Gumbo. Go on, please. Then there was Harvey Vick, the ophthalmologist. He was in deeper than any of us and went to prison for 10 or 15 years. Dillard frowned. As I recall it, Bro arranged everything, but it was Vick who tried to bring the jewels through the customs. Yes, I know, said Gumbo. Vick claimed that Bro framed him, but there wasn't enough evidence against Bro to convict him, and there was against Harvey Vick. The 4th man was Bill Thomas, a Wall Street broker, wasn't he? Dillard nodded. Thomas, Sledge, Dayton and I all paid a stiff fine and the duty on the jewels. But Vick and Thomas went to jail just the same. Thanks, Mike. Gumbo rose. That was all I wanted to know. He smiled sympathetically at the worried expression on Dillard's face. Don't worry. You won't receive any unfavorable publicity from this. I just wanted to be sure to get the facts straight. 2 hours later, Danny Gumbo was back in Stoneville, talking to Chief of Police Roper in his office. "Learn anything from your trip to New York?" asked the chief. "Just about what I expected," said Gumbo, dropping into a chair and filling his pipe. "Anything happen at Vic's place while I was gone?" "Nothing." The little chief looked at Gumbo like a dog begging for a bone. "What's the idea of holding out, Gumbo? You know something that you aren't telling." "I'll tell you as soon as I'm sure of it," said Gumbo. "I think we had better pay a visit to Ridgeway Manor today. There are 300 uncut diamonds hidden around there somewhere, and we'd better find them before the murderer kills someone else in trying to learn where they are." "Let's drive out there now," said the chief, getting to his feet and putting on his cap and uniform overcoat. "I'm tired of waiting around for something to happen." They went out and got into Roper's car. It was just past noon and still chilly for early spring. Soon they had left the village behind and were swinging into the winding driveway of Ridgeway Manor. Gumbo decided he wouldn't live in the dismal place if somebody gave it to him. "2 of my men are still on guard here," Roper said as the car stopped in front of the house and a uniformed patrolman saluted him. "Everything all right here, Kelly?" "Yes, sir," said the patrolman. "Been quiet around here all morning." Gumbo glanced at a mud-spattered roadster parked farther along the drive. It was Dr. Jacob's car and the medico was evidently in the house. Gumbo and Roper climbed the porch steps and rang the doorbell. It was a maid who admitted them. "Where's Shane?" Gumbo asked. "He took the doctor up to see Miss Bro," the girl answered. "She wasn't feeling well. She must have caught a cold last night." "How long ago did they go up?" "It must have been about 10 or 15 minutes ago, sir." "And Shane hasn't come down yet?" Gumbo asked. "No, sir." "Come on, Chief," said Gumbo, running toward the stairs. "Hurry, or we may be too late." He raced up to the second floor of the old house, Roper following. Just as they reached the upper hall, a scream came from one of the rooms along the corridor. Shane stepped out through an open doorway. The ex-prize fighter swore profanely as he saw the two men, then turned and ran in the opposite direction along the hall. "After him," shouted the chief. "He's the murderer." Roper ran down the hall after the butler. Gumbo did not follow. He stepped into the room from which Shane had appeared. Dr. Jacob was seated in a chair beside the bed on which Marie Bro lay. The doctor's fingers were on the girl's pulse. "What's wrong with her, doctor?" Gumbo asked quietly. "Why did she scream?" "She's all right now," Jacob said. "Her pulse is still a little rapid, but I gave her a sedative. It was Shane. He threatened to kill both of us if we didn't tell him where the diamonds were hidden." Miss Bro screamed, and then Shane ran when he realized there was someone in the hall. Gumbo took out his handkerchief and held it to his left eye. "The chief will get Shane. There's not much chance of him being able to escape." He rubbed at his eye. "What's the matter, get something in it?" asked Dr. Jacob, moving over to the tall, dark-haired man. "Better let me take a look at that eye, Gumbo." "Wish you would. Feels like ophthalmia to me." "Nonsense." Dr. Jacob turned Gumbo's face to the window. "There is not enough inflammation for ophthalmia. Your eye looks all right to me." "You are careless, doctor." Jacob suddenly found himself covered by an automatic that Gumbo had produced from the side pocket of his coat. "Or should I say Dr. Harvey Vick?" "Dr. Harvey Vick?" Jacob gasped. "You're crazy." Gumbo glanced at the door as the chief and his men appeared, marching Shane in front of them and with Jimmy Dayton following. "Nice work, Shane. You probably saved your life by running away a few minutes ago, and giving Jacob a chance to insist you were the murderer." "Isn't he?" demanded the chief in surprise. "No," said Gumbo. "Dr. Harvey Vick, alias Dr. Jacob and Thomas Hernandez is the murderer." "Jacob?" There was a dazed expression on Roper's face. "But how did you know, Gumbo?" "First, because Jacob was so careless in giving the time that Bro and Sledge died," Gumbo said, as the chief snapped handcuffs on the doctor. "He evidently did so through his ignorance of the real duties of a coroner. After all, he is, or was, a specialist in ophthalmology. I knew he had been out somewhere the night before last because of his mud-spattered car. But he might have been out visiting his patients." "True, I was willing to grant that." Gumbo glanced at the girl lying motionless on the bed. "You weren't foolish enough to let him give you that bitter-tasting medicine a second time, were you, Marie?" "No, Of course not. Marie sat up. I pretended to swallow it, but I didn't. I realized the taste was the same as the stuff that the masked man forced me to swallow at the inn, so I spat it out into my handkerchief when Jacob wasn't looking. Smart girl, said Gumbo. He shook his head sadly as he looked at the doctor. As I said before, you have been careless, doctor. Tying her to the bed with white adhesive tape, such as a doctor uses, dropping your handkerchief with the sulfurous, chemical odor of iodoform on it, and talking Latin. And then when I suggested that I might have ophthalmia, you could tell just by looking at the eye whether I did or not. That required an eye specialist knowledge. Then I was sure you were Harvey Vick. But who is this Dr. Vick? Demanded Roper. He was the one man who hated Edwin Bro enough actually to kill him, Gumbo said. Bro got Vick into a smuggling deal that sent the doctor to jail for 10 years and ruined his life. When he got out he made up his mind to get Bro. Vick came here about the same time Bro did. He had changed so much during his time in prison that Bro did not recognize him. Perhaps Vick is disguised now, to a certain extent. The red mustache, and in other little ways. I recognized the doctor yesterday when he was in the house here looking for the diamonds, Shane said. I wasn't going to say anything, though. He tried to choke me then, and I knew he might do it again if he got the chance. Later I saw Bentley try to kill Jacob with the rifle at Sledge's cottage. It was then that I knew the doctor must be Hernandez. Why were you sure of that? Gumbo asked. Because Bentley ran away from the cottage badly frightened the moment that Dr. Jacob came into the kitchen, said the butler. I saw that as I was leaving. That's right, Gumbo said, nodding. And Bentley shouted that he had recognized the voice. He meant that Jacob and Hernandez's voices were the same. Of course, said Shane. Why didn't you tell me that when I caught you at the cottage later? Gumbo looked at the butler. I thought I'd better keep quiet. After all, it would be just my word against that of the doctor. I didn't have any proof, and besides, he had tried to strangle me at the house. I knew he was dangerous and I didn't want to be his next victim. But why did he kill Sledge? Roper wanted to know. Since Mr. Gumbo appears to know everything else, let him explain that, Jacob snarled. The detective grinned. All right, I will, he said, looking at the killer. The morning after you murdered Bro you went to Sledge's cottage. He knew you as Jacob. Of course, and also knew that you were really Vic. Doubtlessly you and Sledge planned to get the diamonds from Bro, planned it together. Hernandez was to be an illicit jewel dealer who would take the diamonds off Vic's hands. He had smuggled them into the country. They weren't registered, and he was anxious to get rid of them. Then that was what the special delivery letter must have been about, exclaimed Dayton. Now I understand. Good. It was nice of you, Dayton, to try to protect Marie from knowing her father was a crook by destroying Bro's papers. Gumbo smiled at the secretary. So Sledge arranged the meeting between Bro and Hernandez at the old inn. Bro was no fool. He left the diamonds at home when he went to meet the man he was to deal with. Hernandez killed him and then was disappointed not to find the stones on the body. He tricked us, damn him, Vic shouted hoarsely. All right, Gumbo, you win, but you haven't a bit of real evidence on me. Haven't we? Gumbo looked at Roper. That's where he's wrong, isn't he, Chief? Well, yes, said Roper. We've got a nice collection of fingerprints. 1 or more of them on a handkerchief, 2 on the knife that killed Sledge and a lot of them on that adhesive tape that was used in order to tie up Miss Bro. And those fingerprints are all the same. They'll check with Vic's prints. But why did he kill Sledge? Dayton asked. Because Sledge was willing to rob Bro of the diamond, said Gumbo. But when Sledge found out that Vic had murdered Bro, then he must have protested and was killed by the doctor before he could talk. Bentley may have seen this murder, since he knew Sledge was dead when I questioned him. But where are the diamonds? Asked Shane. I've searched this house for them and couldn't find anything. Mr. Bro had all sorts of strange things around the house stuck in corners. Even had one closet filled with old inner tubes. Patched tubes they are, too. Bring those tubes here, Shane, ordered Gumbo. In a few moments the butler returned with an armful of old inner tubes. Gumbo took one of them and cut a hole in the rubber near the place where it had been patched. He thrust his hand inside and drew out a little package. Here are some of the diamonds, he said, as he opened the package and revealed a few of the gray-green stones. You'll probably find all of them in the rest of these inner tubes. I felt that Bro would have to hide them in some place that was almost too silly and obvious for anyone to look into. If he had hidden them in a secret safe, Shane or Hernandez would have found them long before this. What an idiot I've been, muttered Shane. Right before my eyes for months and I never got wise. Careless of you, Shane, said Gumbo. Almost as careless as the doctor in thinking that the Stoneville Police Department didn't even check up on fingerprints. He smiled ironically at the murderer. A little mental myopia, doctor? The end.